There you go. All right. Yeah, let's just flip over to here. Okay. All right. Topic of the day: front-end testing. Last year, for those who weren't here, we had a dev lunch on, and this will be a very brief presentation, not like my epic Docker presentation. But last year we had a testing dev lunch where we talked about the different types of testing. So I just want to briefly recap that and relate that to front-end testing. So we have unit tests, integration tests, and end-to-end tests. And these are the tools, Mocha and Cypress, that you can use in front-end testing. And Vue CLI makes it really easy, as I'll demonstrate, to hook these tools in. And I think that first and foremost, I've talked to a lot of people on this team about the role of testing, both in back-end and front-end, and should we be writing tests while we're writing features and stuff like that? My short answer is yes. Try to write try to write tests as often as you can for your features, particularly if those features are critical and complex. Critical meaning critical to the business need of the application. Complex meaning it's hard to keep the whole problem in your head at all times. But writing tests for simpler features may not be a bad idea to practice the skill. So again, my short answer is yeah, write them and develop that skill. But traditionally, one of the hardest things about writing tests is just getting the test runner set up. And especially in the front end, because usually it has to integrate with Webpack, and if you want to test things like components that you've written in Vue or whatever, they need to be transpiled before you can run the test and things like that. So you need to make sure your test runner runs after everything is compiled. Believe me, I tried to set this up from scratch, and it can be a nightmare. Well, Vue CLI makes that super easy, and I'll demonstrate that soon. So let me just briefly run through. I know most of you know what these different types of tests are, but I'll run through the definitions of each just to recap and for the sake of the video. So unit test tests a discrete piece of code, whether it's a function or it's a component or a class or something like that. It tests a unit of code in isolation, not connected with anything else. Integration tests are sort of a special kind of test, which will test an interaction usually with a third-party service. So you might write an integration test for interactions that you have with Stripe. I wrote integration tests for Foobly back in the day, and more recently for Festi, for different Stripe features. Just making sure that when we create a new payment, for instance, on our end, and that is behind the scenes interacting with Stripe to create the payment in Stripe system, is our Stripe balance also being updated the way that we expect it to? And if not, then that could indicate that we're either calling Stripe's APIs incorrectly, or there's some logical error on our end. I put a big no icon here because integration tests, you could write them in the front end, but I think they're very rare in the front end. You rarely need them. Mostly you're kind of testing integration with your boutique, dedicated backend that was built to power the front end, and so the better way to test that would be end-to-end tests on the right here with Cypress. End-to-end tests are kind of what the word says. You test the entire thing as the entire application as one thing, end to end. So this Cypress and other tools like it will emulate what the user sees and how the user interacts with the software. And so you're testing everything from the button that you click all the way down to the API that's called on the back end in response to that, all the way back to the front end, to whatever's supposed to happen after you click that button. So if I confirm my payment, it goes goes through some JavaScript, makes an API call, hits the back end. The back end calls Stripe. Stripe returns the call, hopefully successfully. Then Stripe sends that back to the front end, goes back through some JavaScript, and then it shows an alert: payment complete or payment error, whatever is appropriate for that situation. And then you can write your assertion saying this is did I get the response that I expected? But it's very much from the user's perspective. And just briefly, I would say my tendency is more towards end-to-end tests on the front end. I think that would be my recommendation of kind of where to start if you want to start with testing on the front end. I think it's the highest leverage thing that we can do to automate things, particularly if there are, again, critical workflows like onboarding. I have implemented Cypress for onboarding for a couple apps, Soil Nerd being one and Festi being another, and I'll demonstrate the Festi one. And it is not only useful for making sure that those critical workflows are working, but it's also really useful in the development process as you're building those those features out to just fill in the forms for you really rapidly, so that you don't have to keep going back and making up new users. Making up new users and emails and stuff like that, finding a random image to upload for the profile image and all this stuff. That all takes a lot of time in the development process, right? With Cypress, you can save yourself a ton of time and headache, and I'll show you how that's done. So you can actually make it part of your development workflow, something more of a test-driven development workflow, where you write a test in anticipation of the thing that you're just about to build. Like, say I'm about to add a new page, and I want to test that I can navigate to that page through the navigation. Well, I can go ahead and write a test that says, find my nav bar, find the new button I just added to navigate to this page, click that button, and then assert that I've reached the new page. And that would be my first test. And then I start working on the page, and I start writing a test case for each new feature that I'm adding to that page. And it can be a really good workflow, and it's not that different from what you're used to when you do npm run serve or npm run dev. Open up your browser and test the code as you're writing it anyway. You're just doing it manually, and a lot of that stuff can be automated for you, which is really powerful. So I will dig a little bit into the tools. This is a kind of verbose slide, but basically Mocha is a unit test runner for JavaScript, which means that you define your tests using its features. Let me get my head out of the way here. Let's see. There. Okay, so you will define your tests using Mocha's tools, Mocha's language for defining tests, and then Chai is like a flavor added to the Mocha test library that gives you 3 different ways of writing assertions. You can write them as should statements, and different people prefer different styles. I think people like Chai because it opens up all 3 different styles to you. Personally, I prefer assert, which is the third one. That just makes the most sense to me. Assert that this equals that, or that this is a type of that. But you can also, with Chai, you can use should statements. So like foo is your variable, so foo dot should dot be dot a string, and some people really like that. That's basically English. And then the expect statement is similar. I expect this value, and I think it just calls more attention to the value that's under test. Expect that this value is a string or whatever. So Mocha and Chai work together, as I kind of indicated up here. I didn't put a Chai logo in here, but Mocha and Chai kind of work together as a unit testing framework. So those 2 things are together. Mocha is really the core of it, but then Chai is something that people frequently use on top of it to get more expressive assertions about things that you're testing with Mocha. And then Cypress is a category apart. Cypress is a completely separate test runner that pops open a Chrome browser, loads up your app, and then starts executing commands in the browser context, like find button, click button, assert that this div has this content, and so on. And again, we'll look at that. Cypress can also be run headless. That means it can be run without a graphical browser. It emulates the browser environment and executes and is able to execute the things all without showing that on a screen. So that's really useful for our continuous integration environments. When we're running Cypress inside of Docker, it's still able to run even though it doesn't have access to a full Chrome graphical user interface. So that's what headless means. You'll probably see that in documentation and stuff. So I just wanted to call out that term. Any questions on the types of tests and the tools being used?
I have a quick question. What is regression testing? Is that just something that's not used in front end, or what? We've heard that before?
Yeah, I wouldn't call that like a category of testing in the sense that I've presented the categories here. Regression testing to me, and maybe other people have different definitions, just means that you are running tests running automated tests in order to detect regressions. So you might be using them in development, or you might have a continuous integration environment that when you push new changes, automatically runs your tests. And the thing that will happen often is you're working over here on this part of the app, and you don't realize that the thing you're working on here is a dependency over here. And so by making a change here, you've broken this other thing. Having automated tests observing this other thing that you're not thinking about right now will help you detect that regression that you just created. And by regression, they just mean the functionality went backwards, Like you had something that was working, but you broke it, and so it regressed. So that to me is what regression testing is. It's just like the property of automated testing that allows you to detect regressions.
So it's sort of just like testing.
It's just testing. Yeah. I don't know why I don't think of it as a category like this. These are unit tests and end-to-end tests, as you see in integration tests, all have a different like mindset that you bring to them, and they have a different discrete purpose. Whereas regression testing is like any of these three things can detect regressions. Any other questions? Alrighty. So I'm just going to give a quick example of a unit test. This example might be familiar because the last time we did this dev lunch, we dug into it. I like this one because it's deceptively simple. So suppose you have a function, format US dollars. It's supposed to format a value in US dollars. How would you test that function? Does anyone want to take a quick stab at explaining like the thought process that you would use to test a function like this?
Give an input, expect output. You know it's USD. You expect it to be an integer, or you're expected to be some. You need to make assertions about your input, and then it's got to run through some code, and that's what you're going to test when you make assertions about the output.
That's right. I mean, yeah. So you're a little muffled, but for the record, given a certain input, assert that there's a certain output. I think that's a good way of doing it. So like, what would you then do? Okay, so I know I want to. For certain inputs, detect certain outputs and assert that they are correct. So what's the next step?
Are you asking me or everybody? Sorry.
If you want to answer, please. Yeah.
Sure. Sorry about muffled. I gotta put my headphones on.
No worries.
I guess the next step would be kind of thinking through my cases.
Ta-da! Yeah, perfectly done. So here I've gone ahead and put together some random test cases that I came up with, but you could probably come up with more edge cases. So just to walk you through my thought process here, there's first one thing that I like to think about, which is like, what types do I expect to handle, right? And in JavaScript, we don't often think about types unless we're writing TypeScript, so it's just helpful to take this extra step. I want my function to be able to handle both strings and numbers. That's just a decision that I made up front. I could decide I just wanted to handle numbers, or I just wanted to handle strings and throw an error if it receives the wrong type, and that could actually be another test case. Like it doesn't handle numbers, which would be silly, I think, for this function. But like we could say that and then assert that it throws an error if I give it a number or something like that. So what I did here is say, okay, I want to accept strings and I want to accept numbers, and then when my function is done, it's going to output a string. Because I want to have that $ in there, and we'll look at that in a second. But to have the $, that's not part of a number literal, so it has to be a string literal. So just going down the test cases that I built here, I have 99 cents at the top as a string. So I think we'll look at what we expect that to be in a second. Then I have this float here, 20.185433. What I'm thinking here is I want to check rounding with this one and with this one. So if it's 185. I would expect this to come out as 20.19, right? And then this is 10,000, so I want that to come out as $10,000 with the $. And then this is 10,000, and because these are identical values numerically, I would want the output of these to be the same. This is 10,000, but it's got a comma, so I don't know how it's going to handle that. And then finally, I think this is 123,456 something, I don't know, maybe even billions. Just a really long number, and we're going to expect that to have some commas in it. So here are the inputs mapped to outputs, exactly as Bruno said. I want my 99 cents to have a $, and be 0.99, otherwise pretty much unchanged. I want this one around from 20.18 to 20.19, because we're cutting it, and this is a 5 here. But I want this one to round down to 20.18 because it's a 4. And then the rest of these I think are pretty self-explanatory and pretty much what you would expect. There are probably other edge cases. Can anyone think of anything off the top of their head? I think one thing I already said, which I didn't think of to put on this slide, is like if I send an object or an array into this function, what should happen? It should probably fail, or give me a NaN result or something. But any other cases that come to mind that you would want to test?
Negative numbers.
Negative numbers? Yeah.
Something that's not, just really not valid stuff, like file, or something like that.
Yeah, files. Okay.
But according to my bank, negative numbers are valid.
Mine too. Cool. Yeah. I mean, and like I said, I think you could probably think about this for a while and still come up with new things. And again, it's kind of deceptively simple because you think, oh yeah, like as a human, if you see a value that could potentially be a valid dollar value, it's very easy to think about how to write this. Something else I thought about too is like, this kind of inspires this exercise of thinking about the potential inputs in your test cases and potential outputs inspires other features that you might want to add to this thing. For instance, do I always want to show both dollars and cents, or do I want to have a parameter that I can send into this formatUSD function that truncates this to a dollar, and then I need to make sure the rounding is appropriate for that as well. Like, should this be rounded up to a dollar? I don't know, and that also prompts a conversation as a developer with the product side of things. Like, depending on your context, like in certain banks. Well, I think this is the standard among banks to round up for a 5 fraction and down for a 4. But I think in certain financial practice, rounding is a bad thing, and you actually don't want to coerce things to rounded numbers until you're done with the financial computation and stuff. So there are different business rules that could also inform your test cases, and all of this is just to illustrate, like, this is the testing mindset. Sit down and think through all the different ways you could break the thing, and all the different ways that you expect it to behave, and observe any questions that come out of that process, and think about whether that is a question that you need to be taking to the client or to the product manager, and try to avoid making too many assumptions. And we'll look at, I wrote up some test cases for this in Mocha, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. You can also test a component with Mocha and Chai. So here's a basic counter component that I stole from the Vue.js docs. Briefly, same thing. How would you test this? And if someone wants to like talk through what they see in this and ask questions about it, we could start there and then talk about how to test it. Go ahead.
Identify the button and then click it and then identify the count and make sure it goes up.
Cool. So that's how you test it. Does everyone understand what's going on here? I think it's pretty straightforward, but just in case. Nods. Okay, cool. Yeah, so we got a button, adds things up. And then it just has a paragraph that says total clicks with the count. And then we bind the count data. So it's reactive down here. Just so you can get a sense of the syntax, here's how we would write a test for this counter, exactly what Nate described. First, we mount the counter component. The mount function is provided by Vue test utils, which is a Vue-specific test harness for Mocha that integrates with Mocha, that is. That creates a wrapper for us once we mount the counter component. Then once we have the wrapper, we have an API to access sub elements of the wrapper. I think we can just use CSS selectors. And I'm going to be perfectly honest, I prepared some examples here, but I'm not going to be writing live tests because I'm not very fluent in it. And so when I write these tests, and I just want to put that out there too, because I know everyone is kind of scared of these like very specific APIs and stuff. And to be honest, I am too. I don't really know this like the back of my hand, like I do a lot of other APIs that I work with in Python, in Django in particular, and even in JavaScript. But there are really nifty docs and recipes out there, which I have linked at the end of this thing, and I would just have the API documentation up while I'm writing these tests. And first I would think, okay, I want to find a button. I don't know how to write that off the top of my head. Go and find that in the docs, try it out, make sure that I understand how the API is working, and go there. And I would very much lean heavily on that documentation because, first of all, as we saw with Chai, there are a lot of different flavors of how these tests are written. And sometimes, like here, I use the expect syntax, even though earlier I said I prefer the assert syntax, but this is what I found a recipe for online. And so this, I was able to like quickly throw this into my code and stuff. So, just want to be very like transparent about that. Even for me, that is my process here, is to have the documentation up and lean very heavily on it. But anyway, I'll continue walking through this. So we grab the button by doing wrapper.findButton. We grab the text by doing wrapper.find p, and this is very much like kind of what you would do in jQuery or something, or even raw JavaScript with like document.query selector or something like that. We cache those two things so we can use them later, so we just have them as variables here. And then we expect the text to contain total click 0, and that we can see that over here. Spelling counts, capitalization counts, so it has to be exactly the text that we expect to find inside of this p element. Then we grab the button, and it's actually an async operation. As you can see, we just await it. We do button.trigger, we trigger a click on the button, a click event, and then you notice we're not like testing anything that Vue.js is supposed to take care of, right? We're just clicking the button. Vue is supposed to do its magic and handle the incrementing of this button, which it does by invoking this click counter and stuff, or this click event handler here. All that we're testing is that here's the previous state, here's the event, and here's the end state. And this is exactly like the formatUSD example, where here is our input, right? The only difference is we have to verify that, you know, there was a start state, and the start state is what we expected it to be. But here's our input, and here's our expected output, and we're asserting that the output is what we expect it to be. So it's the same mindset. It's just a little bit more complicated in terms of the API, because you're dealing with a component rather than dealing with strings and numbers and stuff that are sort of at a lower level. They're more like primitive values. Here, there's this whole API around interacting with the DOM of the component, stuff like that. Any questions on this?
This is great.
Cool. And I'll show some more examples of this in a minute. Okay, cool. So how do we set up the test harness? Like I said previously, or if you try to do this from scratch, which I do not recommend, it's a world of pain, but Vue has made it very easy, and I'll just demonstrate this in a second, but you can do Vue create my project, and you can select these tools as part of the creation of a new project. And especially as we start to add more components to the components library, components are going to be perfect for Mocha and Chai unit tests. And I really do think we should build out unit tests for our components, specifically for regression testing purposes, to make sure that if you're going in and modifying someone else's component to make it work better for your project, you're not breaking some feature that someone else had already intended to be there. But it's also just good to guarantee you have these generic components that a lot of people are going to be using, so you want to help make guarantees that they are reliable and working as expected when someone else installs them. So I'll show off some unit tests that I started writing for my tag component, and maybe if we have time we can live write some new unit tests, and you can see how bad I am at it. Then I'm going to show the MB subgroup ranking unit tests that I wrote. These are pretty. This is a pretty confusing feature, and these are also honestly pretty confusing unit tests, but I can kind of point to how like more complex unit tests look. Festi onboarding end-to-end unit tests and the Festi create event end-to-end unit tests. Onboarding is relatively easy to test with end-to-end testing because you're creating a user as part of the process, and so that you have like a reference to the user. The challenge that I found writing end-to-end tests for other like deeper features that require a user is it's a little bit harder to make them self-contained because you need a user in the first place. So what I had to do here was build a tool that the test runner could use that created a user through the API, so that I then had that user to log into the app and go and do these do whatever actions they wanted to do in the app. And that way I was able to separate my create event unit test from the registration and onboarding unit tests. I didn't want those two tests to be tied together, right, inherently. So it feels a little bit like a hack. In fact, a lot of what you have to write in an end test will kind of feel like a hack because you're like navigating through the DOM and trying to find pieces, but that is just how it's done. And the end result, I think you'll see, is pretty cool and impressive. And then I've linked resources in here. I guess I didn't link this API documentation, but I'll share these links out after this call. Okay, so let's do some examples. Let's open up a new terminal, and I'll just quickly show. Are you guys able to see this okay?
Yeah.
So I'll go into my workspace. Has anyone not run Vue Create before to create a project?
I only did that back when I was first learning it, so it's hazy. But
Okay, cool. So for this to work, let me quit real quick. For this command to work, so it's very simple. View create. We'll call it test project. You need to first install @view/CLI, which is the name of the package. So you would do npm i-g @view/CLI. This is already installed on my computer, but this is the thing that you need for this view create command to work. Once you have that, oh, I don't need to reinstall it. Hopefully I didn't just break it. Once you have that, it will walk you through, similar to our initializer, but even nicer than our initializer, the process of setting up a new Vue project in the Vue CLI style with all the different tools that you need. I actually have a preset that I created for myself called Think Nimble preset that includes Babel, ESLint, and the Mocha Chai unit testing stuff, but I'm gonna, instead of doing that one, I'm gonna go to, manual select, which would be the default that you would use. So we use Babel. We could use TypeScript, but we don't currently use that across all of our projects. You can go ahead and throw Vuex in there if you're writing an app. For components, you wouldn't need to have Vuex or any sort of like app-specific features. Same with the router. We use router in pretty much all of our projects, so I'd probably select those for a normal project, but for a component, I wouldn't do that. CSS preprocessors, if you're including Sass as CSS, which we do in our projects, you would want to select that. So this is just like selecting the high-level tools that you might use. So I'm going to go ahead and select that, unit testing and end-to-end testing. Now the next step is going to ask me what specific tools I want to use. So here I would select, we usually do Sass with Node Sass, not with Dart Sass. So I'll select that. And then we do ESLint plus prettier, and we lint on save. And then we want Mocha Chai for the unit testing. That's just the one that I'm demonstrating today. We could talk about the merits of Jest. I didn't dig into researching Jest or anything to present it, so I'm not going to talk about it today. But Mocha Chai, and then Cypress or Nightwatch. And again, I'm going to focus on Cypress. Have never looked at Nightwatch. And then finally, I prefer in our projects to place our configs in package.json because I just like one place for all the configs, but that is kind of up to you. And I'm not going to save this for future projects. So then it's going to install all of those dependencies, and we can take a look at that real quick. But actually, I'll just switch over to this one. So this is a package that I created just for this presentation here called FE testing, front-end testing, and I think this should look familiar to you all. I can't really zoom in on this, but this is our standard setup for a front-end app. So usually when you change directories into the client folder of your project, this is what you see. Node modules here, a public folder, a source folder where all the source code is, a test folder, which you probably have always ignored, and then package.json, cypress.json, and various other configs at the top level here. So the test folder is where the tests will live, and in that folder we have a E2E subfolder for the end-to-end tests, and we have a unit test folder for the unit tests. Here is our counter spec here that we just looked at. By default, Vue will give you this hello world example spec, and the naming convention here for all of the tests is, well, at least for the unit test, is .spec.js. That's how Mocha knows to find to include the tests inside of these directories as part of the test runner when it runs the tests. So it looks in here and it looks for tests, and tests are defined with describe. So you want to describe the thing under test, in this case hello world, and then it does something. So if you wanted to write additional test cases, let me see if I have an example of that. Like here, so we're describing formatUSD. And here we have a nested describe, which actually I don't think we need, because you would need that if you were like testing a method on a class or something and you wanted to say this is a sub method of the class. So formatUSD, and here's our first test case. It should format string and number values that are less than 1. So just write, this is arbitrary, just write something for yourself that describes what's under test here, because this, if this fails, this will be outputted to the terminal to say, hey, as you were changing that function, you broke this previous behavior that it was doing a good job at formatting values less than 1 or whatever. And now it's not. So fix it. And then the it value, or this one here is it should round sense properly. And I actually put 2 assertions in here because they kind of both fit the test case. And again, this is like the 20.185 needs to round up to 20.19, and the 20.184 needs to round down to 20.18. And we could go ahead and write more. What I would probably do to write more tests like this is just copy paste that, update my description here. So what was our next test case? Do you remember? It should format string values in the thousands properly. And so here we'll feed it 10,000, and we expect that to come out as 10,000. And I honestly don't know if it will come out that way, so we're going to find out. And then, this could be a separate test case. It should format, number values in the thousands properly. All right, so how do you run these? Over in your directory here. So again, this is the other one I created, FE testing. Inside of package.json, you will see these scripts. And these are all of the npm run commands that you can see. So you're used to running npm run dev or npm run serve, but there's also build, and this gets executed when we push to Heroku or whatever. And then we have our testing, test and test : unit and test : E2E. So if we want to run our unit tests, we do test : unit. And it's here it's doing the compiling and stuff. So let's see, it looks like it failed on something here. So actually all of our formatUSD tests are running just fine. Our hello world test is running fine, I didn't change that. Our counter is failing. And that's funny because this was actually working this morning. But you can see the 2 new test cases that I added here are passing just fine. So when we were putting this input and expecting this output, that's exactly what formatUSD gave us. If we want to prove that it's working properly, we can break the test and rerun the test, and we should get a second error here on top of our counter error. Yep, so there we see that formatUSD is now failing and should format values in the thousands properly, is not working, format string values in the thousands properly, and we can see here exactly what is mismatched. It's missing those two decimal places there. Any questions at this point or comments? And we could go ahead and just write these test cases for all the other ones, but I'm not gonna do that right now.
No questions. This is great. I think it's funny that the functions is just it's like I haven't seen function that like that, not verbose at all. It's just funny that it's not very intuitive to me. Like it.
Yeah.
Really,
Yeah, and the other weird thing about when I said that Mocha as the test runner provides like this framework for defining tests or describing tests, this is what Mocha is providing. And the funny thing is, like, we don't even have to import it here, which is kind of weird to me. We're just all we're importing is assert. We do have to import our assertion library, but not the functions that power the test library. Yeah, and I think this is done to make it less verbose and a little bit more like English. Personally, I don't know where I fall on that trend. I'm kind of ambivalent about the trend of making tests look like English. But there is an argument that tests are a form of documentation. They're a form of documentation about a person's intent, the writer's intent. And so the fact that it's written in English makes it more effective documentation. I think that's fair, as opposed to writing just comments. So this is a comment that is built into the code, and so therefore when the test changes, you're more compelled to update the text that describes what that test does. So I think that's a fair argument, but yeah, I wouldn't mind if this just said function test or whatever. Any other questions or comments at this point? Cool. I don't know why my counter is broken. I'll go back and fix it later, and I can update you guys on why that is. But I think more interesting example is So this past week I wrote a tag component. And it's in our storybook now. Thank you, Corey. And this is the tag, a very simple component.
Yeah.
Shout out. Very simple component that displays a tag, but there's a little bit of hidden complexity here, which is we can show a delete button on that tag. And what's more, when we click the delete button, it emits an on-delete event for us. So hopefully, if you guys have ever had to build tags that you could add to a list of tags and remove from a list of tags, you start to see how this little component could save you a little bit of time in terms of styling. And I was particularly proud of how this handles longer text. So we'll make the text really long in here. So you see how the text wraps, it's not a beautiful tag now, but like if someone had a really long tag like this, which could happen, the text wraps fairly nicely, and all of the elements are still sort of aligned. So this component takes care of all that for you. You don't have to worry about getting into all that CSS and stuff. And over time, we're going to extend this component so that if you want a red tag, you can select the red theme, and the text will turn white for you so that it's still readable, and the icon will turn white, and you don't have to worry about writing all that CSS and stuff. So that's coming down the pike here. But what I wanted to show off is sort of how to test just this assertion of, okay, when I pass in the prop show delete button, is my delete button being shown? So that's a test that I wrote this morning, and I also am on the path to writing a test to make sure that when I click the delete button, it emits this event. I just haven't quite figured out how to do that yet, so didn't have time to resolve that one. So here's the test case here. So we're describing tag.view. We've imported tag.view up here. This, by the way, is the TNView components repository. The tag directory here, I know this is kind of small, but the tag directory here is a Vue project created with Vue CLI in exactly the way I just demonstrated. So I did Vue create tag, and it generated this directory for me. And in the directory, so we have all the stuff that you are familiar with. And by the way, Corey and I are going to standardize, our plan is to standardize around creating new components this way so that we can package those components up to be installable from npm. So we have a public folder, just like any other Vue project. We have a source folder with components and tag in it. We have app.vue. We don't really need app.vue because this isn't a full app, but I just kind of left it in there because I was being lazy. But tag.vue is in here, and that's the thing that we really care about. And then we have test/unit, and I created tag.spec.js. In fact, I think I just renamed example.spec.js and started updating the code inside of it, importing tag instead of importing hello world, and then renaming things inside of the test case. So the first thing I did was, well, I didn't do this first. The first thing I did was figure out how to find the delete button. And the first thing I noticed was like, well, I want to find the delete button, but then I want to assert that it doesn't exist. So I had to go into the to the documentation of Vue test utils. So let's take a look at what that looks like. This documentation here, you can go to API and you can see all the things that you can do with this. So again, when you mount a component or when you shallow mount a component, which I think just doesn't mount components within the components, it only mounts the top level component, I'm pretty sure, you get back the wrapper. So once I have a wrapper, I can go into the wrapper API and see all the things that I can do with a wrapper. I can find things, I can destroy things, check whether it's empty, whether it's visible, and stuff like that. So again, this is what I was saying, like my process for writing this test, even this little test here, was to have this web page open, and when I thought of something that I wanted to do, I was like, okay, well, how am I going to do that? And looked for a likely method over here that would do that thing for me. So that's how, I actually think I tried out, before I did find, I think I tried out one or two other methods like .contains, and then I learned that .contains was deprecated and to use find instead. So, you know, it's sort of a process of learning and exploring that stuff. That's the counter. So yeah, so got my wrapper. I found the delete button class, which I had just had this hard coded in there to begin with. And then I wanted to assert equal that delete button exists is false. So it's asserting that the delete button is not found. And that is the default behavior of the tag, as we saw when you load up a tag, by default, there's no delete button. So that's a pretty straightforward test case. It does not render a delete button by default, but does it render a delete button when props.show delete button was passed? And I think this is a good example because it shows you how to pass a prop to your component when you mount it using the test runner. So again, we're using shallow mount, but this time we're passing in a configuration object, and we're passing in props data. Show delete button is now true, and we're getting back, again, we do the same logic as we did above. Find inside of our wrapper, our tag again is what the wrapper represents. Find the delete button class, and now assert that exists is true, that the delete button exists. And then it was at this point that I was like, oh, I should make this a constant just in case I ever decide to rename this class, and it'll make it easier for me to update my my test cases. One thing that I will call out here, which a lot of people have kind of remarked on looking at tests like this, is that your class names suddenly become less fungible. And more important. And again, I think that is a good thing, especially for components, because this is going to be sort of an interface that other developers use to interact with your component, particularly with styling it. They will need reliable class names and predictable class names. So being thoughtful about your class names and actually writing tests around it that kind of cement them in place is not a bad thing in my mind. And then finally, I started writing a test case, ran out of time, emits an on delete event when the delete button is clicked. I think I will use this emitted thing on the wrapper, but I'm not entirely sure yet, so I'm gonna learn how to do this. So it looks like you can manually emit events, then you can trigger the next tick on your Vue.js VM view model, and then you can say, I expect the wrapper to have emitted a certain event. But I'm not sure. I don't fully understand this API yet, so I want to spend more time with that. Cool. Any questions?
Do you know why you had to use shallow mount for the component versus when you were using mount for the counter? Like here on the counter you use mount, and then here you use shallow mount.
I don't think I had to. In fact, I think I think in their documentation they use shallow mount, and I was like, well, mount should work this as well, right? Especially since there's no nested components, but I think it's a performance thing. I think that when you're writing unit tests, shallow mount, if you don't need to test nested components, like if this counter had a tag inside of it or something, if you don't need to test the tag inside of the counter, doing a shallow mount is good enough, and it's going to save processing time while these tests are running. Because often tests run, especially in a CI environment, you're being charged by the minute. Or by compute power or something like that. So you want your tests to be lightweight. You also want your tests to run fast. If you're running them in development, like in the background, you don't want to have to wait 10 minutes every time you make a change to make sure that you didn't cause a regression. So yeah, I think that's the difference between the two. Any other thoughts? Okay, cool. So I had a couple more examples I wanted to run through. We looked at the tag component. Let's look at, okay, so this will conclude our unit tests thing, and then we'll look at end-to-end tests after that. The MB subgroup rankings. I was thinking this morning about how to briefly describe what's going on here, because this was a big hairy thing. I have a 4-hour video on refactoring this if you really want to understand what's going on. In short, we basically had one complex data structure that we were transforming into another complex data structure. And in the process of that, I think we started with what are called group weights, which was a list of objects that had for each group in MB, and Joseph, my memory's fuzzy on this, so help me out here. But for each group in MB, like groups could be, for example, Joseph.
What were groups? They were the different types of tags, or higher level group. Were those like I cared about culture, public health in my community, like cheap housing, good education. Like these are the types. These are what we consider groups for different aspects of it. Like, and then a subgroup might be good private schools under the group of education. If that makes sense.
That's right. So yeah, actually I had it backwards before. So there were these big groups like culture and like accessibility of like commerce and stuff in my neighborhood and things like that. And then there were these subgroups that were underneath those groups. And the users were asked to rank the subgroups, but then we needed to roll up their scores in the subgroups to the group level. So that's what I mean by, like, we had this list of subgroups in rank order, like from, like, this is my top subgroup, this is my next one, I like dog parks, I like this, I like that. And then we needed to kind of compress that down to 6, I think it was like 6 unique groups that were scored based on how they had ranked the subgroups. So it was this complex data structure to another complex data structure. And this function here, from ranked subgroups, it generated those group weights, which are basically the scores for each group, from a list of subgroups that were in force ranked order. So it had to figure out, okay, if it's number 1, then its score, I think the way the scores worked, like if you had 10 subgroups, the first thing in the list would have a score of 10, and the last thing in the list would have a score of 1. And so that's how the group weights were computed. So if I ranked 3 things at the top of my list that were all in the same group, then the group weight would be 10 plus 9 plus 8. And that's how the group weight would be calculated. So I think that's enough said about how the calculator worked. Just like a big list of objects to another list of objects with some math in between to reduce it down. So here are the test cases. First, we define, oh yeah, I should have just looked at this. First, we define our groups. We had culture, economic opportunity, environment, housing, parks and rec, like if you liked a dog park or something like that. Transport, like I want to be close to a metro station, might be a subgroup that you rank and stuff like that. Youth and family. Then we have a list of group weights that I just made up that we could use for testing. So this is what the final data structure is supposed to look like. So in terms of like asserting outputs, I believe this variable is used in my assertions to say, once I run this function, the output should look like this. So actually this is great because this is a really good example of how tests can be good documentation, because you just saw how I was struggling to remember how this worked and what the inputs and outputs looked like. It's all written down right here. This is what an output looks like. This is exactly what my complex resulting data structure is supposed to look like. I'm supposed to get a user group weight object for each of the groups with a weight, a score, a group ID, and then a group, the group ref just means that it's pointing at one of these objects up here. So this is like the format that we use in a lot of APIs, where we have the name of something, and that's just an ID, and then we have the group ref, which is the full object. So that's what's happening there. So I have my list of group weights, and this is what I expect my output to look like given certain inputs. Then I have ranked subgroups. So for here I faked it. So here all I did was take my group objects. I didn't create full subgroup objects. I just took my group objects because they were the only thing that mattered for the subgroup ranking calculate, or for the group weight calculation. And I created a list of subgroups in an arbitrary order. So this would be like if I had a subgroup that was part of the culture group. Say it's like I want an opera house near my house or something like that. That's the first thing. It was also the third thing in the fifth thing here. So I'm sort of manufacturing this so that culture scores highly. And then I mixed in some public health and some of the other groups. So this is a good example of how, like, you don't, for your testing purposes, just think about the one thing that you want to test. Here, I'm not testing full-blown subgroup objects. The only thing that matters is that a subgroup belongs to a group, and that subgroups are ordered in a specific way, and then we generate the scores from that. So that was the only thing that I built out for my test case. And then finally, just different test cases. So what I was testing here was this whole calculator class as different things, or rather the different methods of the calculator class. So it should generate chart labels in the correct order. That is just testing this chart labels getter here. And this does some magic to make sure that the chart labels don't change order. You could also feed in a custom order for your chart labels, or like custom chart labels. So this just asserts that the chart labels come out in the proper order by comparing two different arrays. So when I run group weight calc.chart labels after parameterizing my calculator with the group weights, then I expect the resulting array to have these group these group chart labels in this specific order. I'm flying through this, but hopefully you're getting the gist of things here. It should allow chart labels to be overridden. So this is what I was saying about like that property of where I can pass in a custom list of chart labels. This is just asserting that I can pass in the chart labels in a different order and still and get the chart labels back out in the order that I specified. It should generate chart values in the correct order. Same thing, just making sure that it's ordered properly. So you see, I'm like testing this from a lot of different angles based on the features that I added to my class, and I wanted to test each feature. I think we're good there. I'm gonna just stop there on this, but this is a good example. I can share out this code to you guys. This is a good example of like a more complex unit test, and the reason I wrote these things is because, again, this was a critical aspect of the user experience working with MB. Like this was the thing that you did with MB, was you ranked your subgroups, and then you got a nice chart showing your priorities, reduced up to the 6 different or 8 different groups. So it's critical, and it was obviously quite complex. Based on those 2 criteria, I was like, okay, I need to write tests around this for posterity, and especially coming back to it 6 months later, so I know what the hell I was thinking at the time and what it was supposed to do. Cool. Questions, comments?
How did you decide which parts of this you wanted to test and which parts you felt like were fine? Because it's like with tests, sometimes it's hard for me to know when I should go really in the details versus when I should give it input and test output, and if that's good enough. For something like this, there's a lot of math in between on both the front end and back end that happens here, and it's like I would have an inclination to test it, but it's hard to decide that sometimes.
Yeah, that's fair. This ended up being a pure front-end thing. At least the calculator aspect of it. I know there was some interaction with the back end, and like we had to pull down subgroup rankings and stuff. But at least for the purposes of the refactor that I did here, this was all on the front end. Once I had this, I did not take a test-driven approach to this. I wrote the test after the fact, after I had refactored it. Once I had it refactored, I wrote a test case for each method. So that's how I decided which test cases to write. And then once I had a test case for each method, I wrote a test case for sort of each parameterization of the method. So it's very much the input-output way of thinking of like chart labels. Chart labels is configured up here, depending on how it can be null, right? So like there's two major like parameterization options for chart labels. You either don't pass it in, and chart labels are generated based on the resulting group weights, or you do pass it in, and chart labels are exactly what you passed in. So I knew I wanted to write 2 test cases, one testing the first situation where you pass something in, one testing the second situation. And same with all these other ones, except they're not really parameterizable. All of these other ones are pretty much just straightforward getters. I think that's where it's also helpful to write things in like a pure functional style like this, where you have one output for any given input, because then it makes it imminently more testable. So all of these are getters because depending on the list of group weights that you pass in, they always give you the same output for the same list of group weights.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I do think to the thing of like having this feeling like you want to test everything. I do think you have to resist that urge, and only it's a practice skill. Like only focus on the things that like matter the most. And what I found is that like simpler is better. And maybe I could pull out some Python examples of that too. Like you really want to reduce this down to just input to output. Don't try to test the intermediate steps or anything like that, because there may be too many paths. But I think if you're having a hard time reducing it down to a single input to a single output, that's probably an indication that something needs to be refactored.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
One issue that I have with the test is slightly different, but it's like sometimes I feel like stuff gets more complex as you do more things to it. So it makes me want to like concatenate my tests and make my tests rely on each other. Like, you know, for like the ed sites like chatbot builder that Victor built.
Yeah.
It's like, we want to build a chatbot, then we want to save it, then we want to go back and edit it and then update it, and then we want to go back and like make sure the update didn't change anything. Like you have to sort of like build them on top of each other. And I know that's also sometimes bad because it's nice to have an independent like testing creating separate from testing updating, so that like if you want to make a change, like you don't have to like it doesn't like break everything. So,
right on. I think to the greatest extent possible, the rule of thumb is like let's keep each test separate and independent. And that's actually very relevant to what I want to show on this Festi test. What that indicates to me, like that the problem that you're encountering there, is that a lot of your functionality depends on the system being in a specific previous state, right? And with the chatbot, just to like sketch it out, I can imagine that like to ask a specific question, another specific question and another specific answer to that question have to pre-exist, right? And so I think that's what you're struggling with, is like the system has to be in a very specific state. And you could, well, I guess your two options are this. Like one is you build it up test over test, right? You build up the state incrementally. So like this test adds the user or whatever and the question. This test answers the question, so that the answer exists in the database. And then this test asks the next question. You could do it that way, or you could separate the state out into like helper functions that do each of those increments, and then rerun each increment in each test. And that is slower, but that does decouple the third test from the previous two that came before it. Or it can also decouple test number 2 from test number 1. So that's probably, again, that kind of goes to like the pure functional programming aspect of things. I think like well, I don't know if I want to get into that too much, but I can talk a little bit about the theory of pure functional programming. Let me just put it this way, like in the pure functional programming paradigm, when you press a button on your keyboard, that button press event plus the entire state of the system is your input, and then the output is like that goes into your computer, and then the output is a new state of the system that incorporates that button press event. Does that make sense? So it's like it's very similar to our chatbot example, where it's not only asking the new question that is the input to your function of asking a chatbot question, but it's also the entire pre-existing state of the system, which in many cases is way more complex than your one input event. And then it's how the entire state of the system changes that is sort of your assertion under test after you've run your function. So you kind of want to assert the entire state of the system to begin with, and then run your function, and then assert the entire state of your system after the fact, which is not typically how we think when we're thinking in an imperative sense. In an imperative sense, we think more like incrementally, like first this event happened, this event happened, this event happened. We don't think about how those events added together create a distinct state of the system. Anyway, that's off topic and getting a little heady. So I know there's probably a lot there, so I'm just gonna drop that and move on to the end-to-end testing. So let's see, how do we want to demo this? I have too many windows open. All right, so for Festi, here we go. I wrote. This is where I've written the most robust end-to-end tests. I had them also written for Soil Nerd, but that's an old project and they're probably broken. These tests I know are passing because I made them part of the pipeline, and they have been passing. I'm going to walk you through the code real quick, but then we'll get visual. So this test tests the registration workflow. It goes to the home page of the app, makes sure that there's a sign up and a login button. And again, keeping it super simple, like I just expect those buttons to exist. I need them, the users need them. So that's all I want to test in this first case, like those buttons exist. Then I want to click a button. So I'm going to find the sign up button, and I'm going to click it. And again, this syntax takes some getting used to. And after that's done, the URL should have the register as its path. So this is verifying that I navigated successfully. Now this kind of goes to Joseph's question of like, well, where do you stop? Do I now like assert that the register page has all these form fields and stuff like that. I decided not to do all that because I knew I was about to fill in those form fields. So in a sense, I'm asserting that those form fields exist by interacting with them. So I did not, like in this test case, go through and say this field should exist, this field should exist. I like stopped myself and just moved on to the next thing. And I think that is just something you have to practice, and probably more of an art than a science. So here I'm registering a new user and navigating to the profile page. How do you register a new user? Well, how would a user do it? They would add their email, they would add a password here, and you can see .type will literally type an email address. Then they click the submit button, they have to accept the terms of service. That's what this one is doing. And then they click the submit button. And then after that, I should be on the create profile page. One thing that I want to call out here, like I mentioned that I created a bunch of tools for myself that make things easier. I created this random string function. Created is a loose term. I copied and pasted a random string function off the internet. And I'm using it to create a random email called test plus random string at test.com. And definitely make sure that you have email disabled on your backend, or you will send a lot of bad emails to people, which I think I did. Well, to test.com, which I'm not sure anyone has that email, but I apologize if they do. Yeah, we got a bounce warning from Mailgun. So, okay, it completely.
Are you using XPath here to identify the items, the elements?
No, these are, no, I'm not using XPath. That's a good question. I think that's a Selenium thing, right?
XPath?
Yeah, I think that's a Selenium tool.
Oh, I don't actually know. I used it I just heard about it like a couple weeks ago, and I needed it to find a particular form on a Django admin page from using Python.
Gotcha.
I know that XPath is just like, it's used by Selenium, but it's part of just HTML selectors, the HTML element API.
Oh, cool. Yeah, these are just CSS selectors. They might also be XPath selectors. I'm not too familiar. I've only heard of XPath in the context of like Java and Selenium. But yeah, maybe it's more standard than that.
Because in the previous example, you were using like the class name, and I guess this is like the same. This is like the same thing. It's like you're not using the class name, but you're using like what's in the input and like an element or something.
Right. Yeah. Here I'm using like attributes of the element. Yeah, and again, that's a matter of style and preference. Here, I was thinking, well, I didn't build the UI with these tests in mind. Had I done so, maybe I would have added IDs to each of these fields and then keyed off of the IDs. But I wanted to try writing these tests while modifying the UI as little as possible and like trying to keep it separate from the UI a little bit. So I knew like this will always be an input, and it's likely always going to have the placeholder of email. And in a sense, this is sort of an assertion that the placeholder says email, because if this fails, maybe somebody went in there and created a regression by changing it to email address, and now I need to go and update my test cases to modify that. So yeah, I could walk through these other ones. I mean, this gets kind of interesting where I have to upload an image as my profile image. So I have a fixture, which is this image of myself as HackerMan, and I just upload that as all the profile pictures for my test users. So we provide some file content here. I forget what force true does, but I needed it to work. I just set the file input to that. I wait 500 seconds. You end up doing this a lot. You have to wait for the UI to do things. Sometimes you will see failures. It's kind of an annoying aspect of Cypress. The test will fail because something takes longer than you expected, and you have to go back and kind of tweak your delays and stuff like that. So this is what I was saying before about sometimes this stuff will feel a little bit hacky, but it is also sort of a more natural interaction with your product than unit tests. Unit tests are so zoomed in, they miss sort of the big picture. Your unit tests could all be passing and your app could be completely broken, whereas this will probably pick up on your app being completely broken in a more straightforward way. And we
so it's testing performance too. That's so hypothetically, if you made that number really, I guess if that those milliseconds, that's like waiting for the API to respond.
Yeah, in this case, yeah, it's waiting for the API to respond. Yeah, in a sense, it's end-to-end. It's testing everything in a sense.
So you could, hypothetically, you could like make that a variable and like run this whole thing with like different values for that variable and like be, okay, like we're asserting that like the whole sign-up process is like responding in less than like 500 milliseconds. But today it's like 2000 milliseconds or something. So
exactly.
Like
yeah.
But wouldn't that depend on like what my internet or computer access is like, rather than what the tests are showing? Like I don't know.
Or the internet of the CI environment and stuff. Yeah. And so
sorry.
Go ahead.
So right now this end-to-end testing, we're doing a lot of like the UI tests. What about doing tests for like API calls directly without worrying about what the UI is, like async calls?
Yeah, you could do that. I wouldn't call that as much end-to-end. That actually is probably more of like integration testing. At that point, I don't know. Yeah, maybe you'd want to do that, just to assert that the API hasn't changed on you. In our
a lot of the examples that they have on this are always like people asking the question about how do I do the async call, load in my services file, and making a mock HTTP request.
Yeah, see, I just don't. I don't entirely see the point of doing that when you have an end-to-end test runner, because those calls will be made sort of as a matter of course, unless you want to be like really granular and you want to say, I expect the API to have exactly these fields in it, and if there's a field added or a field removed from this, I want to know about it right away, which I think you would potentially want to do with a third-party service, just in case like they mess up and they don't version their API and they change something on you. But with your own services, because you can fix that so readily, I would just test the critical path like from the user perspective using end-to-end testing, and if something in the critical path breaks because of an API change, then you want to know about it. But if someone added a new field or something, then and it doesn't break anything, then no harm done. And
what about something like session? No, what is session? Like when a user logs in, like the Vuex stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a sense, again, you're testing that with it. If you have user-facing functionality that depends on those things, these end-to-end tests will pick that up, because that user-facing function won't behave the way that you assert that it should. That said, you can use this to write the kinds of tests that you're asking about. So here in commands, you can write custom Cypress commands. So here in commands, I've written a command called register that runs Cypress code here to call the user API to register a new user. And here I'm just registering a user with a random email. This is so that I don't have to go through the UI to register a user. I can just call the API directly. I have this written as a custom command, so I can call it easily. But I could also write this as a test case to make sure it succeeds and creates the token in the Vuex store like you're describing. I could write assertions around that using Cypress. That is.
And do you save that? Did you so when you get that response back, are you saving it somewhere so you can do further testing, or is that something that we're hamstrung on?
No, I'm saving it right here. I'm saving it to the store. So within the context of the test that I'm running, and I'll show how this works in the event create test. It is saved to the Vuex store. It's just this kind of weird syntax where I had to alias the store with this double underscore. So I actually had to change store index.js. Sorry, let me find it. Right here. I had to add this code to my store/index.js to say if Cypress is running, then create an alias on the window. So this is just a global variable that points to the Vuex store as an object, and then a global user variable that points to the user. And this is what I wanted to demonstrate as like, this was a hurdle I had to overcome to make my end-to-end tests a little bit more discrete from one another, because I had the same problem that Nate was describing about his tests, where I needed a user for every test. So what I ended up doing in the beginning was I would always run my onboarding tests and I was like literally copy pasting those over into the new test, and I was like, this is way too verbose, and I don't need to test onboarding again and again and again. It's going to slow down the test runner. So I figured out how to shortcut that by writing this custom command that lets me create a user on demand and then save it to the window so that I can reference that user as I go through the test. All right, we're running low on time, so I just want to demo what this looks like and sort of what the workflow is. So again, I'm in my web app directory. My client directory just happens to be called web app on Festi, and I'll do npm run test :e2e, and it's going to start up a Chrome browser. Well, first it's going to start up a Cypress client, and then when I run my test, it's going to open up a Chrome browser with my app running in it, and it is going to start running commands against it. And just like your development server, you see it actually runs a development server alongside of it, still on port 8080. Just like your development server, it hot reloads and all that good stuff. So I can be changing my code. Every time I change my code, the test will run again. So again, that's how I would detect regressions while I'm in process. And this has taken an awfully long time.
Do you have to localhost first or no?
It opened it for me as part of running the test E2E command. It knows how to start the development server and everything. It doesn't know how to run a backend. Actually, that's the thing that I have to test or check here. I do need to have a backend running. So I have Festi in Docker, so it looks like that's running. And I actually think I have this configured to use ngrok right now, so let me set that up.
Docker on one of our
Yeah, it's been working really well on Festi. Not for the front end dev, especially because of Cypress. Like it's hard to run Cypress inside of Docker. But for the back end stuff, if I don't have to change it too much, it's nice to just kind of have it always running there. So here's what the Cypress client looks like. And then I can click Run All Specs. It's open Chrome, and it's going to start running through each test case. Really cool, some really cool features here. So it goes really fast too. This is going through all those steps I described before. Here it's filling out a form for me, testing like that you can add a new business account and a new personal account. And it's putting in a lot of random values here, or like values that I sort of pre-programmed that are good for testing. I also really like using random values because you catch some corner cases. There's my HackerMan picture. You catch some corner cases that you may not have anticipated before, like, oh, this string is way too long and it's being, your request is being rejected. So a cool feature of this is you can actually step back, step by step, particularly for failures, this is useful, and see what Cypress was doing at each step and what the state of your app was at each step. So here it's checking that these two buttons exist. In the next test case, it's clicking on the sign up button, so you see that little red dot for the click. It's navigating, and then it's finally going to assert that this URL is what it's supposed to be, and it says it's succeeded. For some reason it didn't update the URL up here, but it says that it found register in the URL as it expected. Now it's going to fill out the placeholders, fill out the inputs with random input. So there, it typed that in, and I really like how it kind of animates it, like animates the typing as it goes. That's kind of unnecessary, but it works. So you can see here it generated a random email. It's going to generate a random password and click this button. So yeah, if this fails for whatever reason, I can step back step by step and see what went wrong and at what point it went wrong. And like I said, you can really use this to guide your development workflow. You can write a test saying like I just added a new page. Let me see if I can get in here somewhere interesting. Like I added a new page to the nav, so I have a new link up here. Assert that new link exists, assert that it's clickable, and assert that once I click it, I'm on a new page. That would be like a very common test case, and you could see yourself writing that before you actually build the page, so that it's double checking that exists. Cool. That's everything I wanted to demo. So we got 3 minutes. If there's any other final questions here.
It looks so cool. It's so cool to watch it run in the browser. It's just pretty fun.
Yeah, it's Yeah, it's fun to watch it, and it's again super useful because like particularly for these onboarding workflows or these forms like the Stripe form, it takes forever to fill those out, and it just knocks it out like that. Cool. Well, we can wrap it there unless anyone else has any other questions. Cypress is pre-installed on all projects. I think we would need to figure out if we wanted to write unit tests on the front end. We would need to figure out how to add Mocha to pre-existing projects. I think there may be a command for it, but if not, we can write up a tutorial for that. My personal opinion is that unit tests are higher leverage on the front. I'm sorry, end-to-end testing is higher leverage on the front end than unit tests, except where you have really complex logic on the front end, like that subgroup rankings thing. But most of that sort of logic, in my opinion, belongs on the back end and should be should warrant unit tests on the back end and integration tests on the back end. So to the extent that you have, if you wanted to get started using this today, I would consider those things that in your development you spend a lot of time repetitively doing. Write automated tests around that and save yourself that time going forward. It's going to be well worth the investment, and you'll learn something about how to do this, and then that'll help you spot opportunities in the future for writing tests like this.
So you guys remember how Nate built this script, this bash script that allowed him to generate a new view component?
Yeah.
Do you remember that? So, and then there was talk like, oh, well, you could have just done that by doing some like short, like I don't know, like hitting some keys in the editor, hitting tab, right, and it auto completes the skeleton of a component. But back then, I talked about how what Nate built can be leveraged to do things like incorporate some automatic test generation, right? So if imagine grabbing Nate's script and generating a new component, right, and being able to say put it in this folder or wherever, and then not only do you get the component, just kind of like the bare bones component, but you also get some very basic tests or like the files for the test for this component, which include a test for did this component render, right? Like that's an easy test that's very straightforward, and maybe there's other very basic tests that we could have, but the point is you could generate a component file, have it, and have like some tests ready to go. So for that component, so I think that's how we can leverage what Nate wrote, and we can expand on it, because that really, like, I guess I always bring this up, that it reminds me of Rails. Rails does that. You generate, it's like if in the back end you generate a model, and then you automatically get some tests written for the model already. So I think that'd be pretty cool. Just wanted to share that again.
Absolutely, yeah. I think we could work on that. And there may be snippets like Emmet or something that can pre-generate those for us. Any other?
I think that would be really cool, especially for the components library.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to mention that our CI pipeline is already set up to run. It should already run end-to-end tests anytime you open a PR, whenever master is updated. It just never really affects us because we don't have any unit tests, or I'm sorry, end-to-end tests written. But it is already completely set up, so you should just need to start writing your tests, and CI will execute them before you merge. So
what Corey is saying, it's too nice to say. There's no excuses. Start writing tests today.
That's awesome. So I will reach out to, it sounds like William and Corey and Perry, you guys have all written this before, is that right?
I think so.
Yes.
Yeah.
Cool. So I'll reach out to some of you guys if I have problems setting it up or anything. But excited to get tracking on this.
Nice. Cool. Yeah, and I'll post those resources, like I said. Any other questions you guys have following this, or anything that I mentioned that I glossed over too quickly, I'm happy to answer those questions. So just let me know. All right, thanks,
cool.
guys.
Thank you for this, William. This is a really awesome dev lunch.
Yeah, I agree. It was awesome.
Thank you.